is past midnight in an ordinary bedroom. The heater clicks on, then off. A streetlight bleeds yellow through the blinds, and on the wall, near the corner where the ceiling begins its slow surrender to gravity, is moving, not quickly, not visibly in the way a fly or a spider moves, but moving in a sense that operates on a timescale longer than your breath, longer than your sleep, longer than the lease on this apartment. A single pale filament, thinner than a strand of hair. It hangs from the seam where the wall meets itself, swaying very slightly in the draft from the vent. You have walked past it for months. You may have, thinking, reached up and pulled at one of its cousins yesterday, or last week, or every spring when the dry air arrives and the walls begin, quietly, to shed. You always tell yourself the same thing. A loose thread, a stray fiber from the drywall tape, a piece of lint that drifted up from the carpet and snagged on the paint. You pull it. Something resists. You pull harder. Longer strand emerges than you expected, dragging a faint white trail behind it, like a root pulled from soil. That resistance is not lint. That resistance is not a thread. Filament hanging from your wall is something the construction industry quietly calls a paper tape tail, or, in the older trade vocabulary, a joint feather. It is the visible, frayed edge of a much larger structure buried inside your wall, a continuous, papery skeleton that holds your entire room together. When you pull on it, you are not removing debris. On the outermost fiber of a laminated paper bandage that has been bridging the seam between two sheets of drywall since the day this room was built. That bandage is called joint tape. Powder around it is joint compound, often nicknamed mud. And the strand you keep yanking on is the loose end of a system that runs, uninterrupted, across every wall, every ceiling, and every corner of nearly every home built in North America since around the late 1940s. It is not decoration. It is not a flaw. It is the load-distributing nervous system of your interior architecture. Everything you were taught about drywall is incomplete. You were probably told, in passing, that walls are made of sheetrock, large rectangular panels of gypsum sandwiched between layers of paper. That much is true. What you were not told is that those panels, on their own, are nearly useless. A sheet of drywall by itself cracks, sags, telegraphs every shift of the house, every season of expansion and contraction, a footstep on the floor above. The reason your walls look like a single, smooth, continuous surface, the reason they do not visibly split along every seam every winter, is because of the thin paper or fiberglass mesh you keep mistaking for trash. The tape is the wall. Panels are merely the filler between the tape's careful, invisible grid. Prowl that strand, and you are not cleaning. You are unstitching. This matters more than it sounds. Every year, drywall contractors are called to thousands of homes to repair what homeowners describe as a sudden, mysterious crack, a hairline fracture that appeared overnight along a ceiling line, or running diagonally from the corner of a doorway. In a meaningful percentage of those cases, the crack did not appear overnight. It was started weeks or months earlier, idly pulling a small white thread while watching television. Once the paper tape is breached at any point, the joint beneath it loses its tensile bridge. The mud, brittle on its own, begins to flex. Line fissures propagate outward along the seam. Humidity enters, paint lifts, and by the time the crack is visible, the original culprit, that one curious tug, has long since been forgotten. There is also a quieter cost. Tape and the gypsum core together form one of the most effective passive fire barriers in residential construction. A standard half-inch sheet of taped, mudded drywall can hold back the spread of a house fire for roughly 30 to 60 minutes. That is not an arbitrary figure. It is the window inside which most occupants escape and most fire crews arrive. Disturb the tape, and you are not just risking a cosmetic crack. You are, in a small way, thinning the membrane between a kitchen fire and the bedroom where someone is sleeping. Begin with the material itself. Powder you see around a torn tape is gypsum. Calcium sulfate dihydrate, a soft sedimentary mineral mined from ancient evaporated seabeds in places like Nova Scotia, Iowa, and the Paris Basin. Plaster of Paris is not a marketing flourish. It is a literal reference to the gypsum quarries beneath the hill of Montmartre, which fed European construction for centuries. Of gypsum is that roughly 21% of its weight is water, chemically locked into its crystal structure. When heat from a fire strikes a gypsum wall, that water is slowly released as steam, absorbing enormous amounts of thermal energy before the wall itself can rise above the boiling point. Your wall, in a sense, sweats to save you. Now consider the paper. The brown facing on the back of every drywall sheet, white facing on the front, are not incidental wrapping. They are structural. Drywall paper is engineered from long fiber recycled cellulose, calibrated for tensile strength along two axes. It is what allows a brittle mineral slab to behave mechanically like a flexible sheet. Without that paper, gypsum is chalk. With it, is a building material that can span 16 inches between studs and carry the weight of cabinets, mirrors, and bookshelves for decades. Now consider the seam. Sheets of drywall butted against each other create a thin, vulnerable canyon. Into that canyon goes a layer of wet joint compound, then a strip of joint tape, either a paper ribbon perforated for adhesion or a self-adhesive fiberglass mesh, then a second, wider layer of compound, then a third, feathered out almost invisibly into the surrounding wall. A skilled taper applies these coats over the course of 3 days, each to dry, sanding lightly between passes until the joint becomes mechanically stronger than the panels it joins. This is why, when a house settles violently, drywall cracks almost never run along the taped seams. The field of the panels themselves. The tape has, quite literally, become the strongest part of the wall. Now zoom out. The taping system you are looking at was not invented in a single laboratory. It evolved, roughly 4 decades, out of older traditions. The lath and plaster walls of the 19th century, in which thin wooden slats were nailed across studs and coated in lime plaster mixed with horsehair. Drywall, in 1916, under the name Sacket board, was originally treated as a cheap temporary substitute for real plaster. It took the labor shortages of the Second World War and the explosive post-war housing boom, which drywall into nearly every American home. Joint tape, in its modern form, was refined alongside it, quietly, by tradesmen in basements and on job sites, long before it entered any textbook. Now, zoom out further. The walls around you are part of an unbroken material lineage that stretches back at least 4,000 years. The Egyptians used gypsum plaster to coat the inner chambers of the pyramids, frescoed their palace walls on gypsum-based grounds. Medieval European builders applied lime and gypsum over woven reed mats. The strand on your wall is, in a strange and literal sense, the latest visible expression of a technology humans have been refining since the Bronze Age. A thin, fibrous membrane laid across a mineral skin, holding a shelter together. And finally, consider what lives inside that membrane. Drywall paper is cellulose, and cellulose, in the presence of even slight humidity, supports a microscopic community. In indoor mycology have documented dozens of fungal species that colonize the paper facings of wall systems, particularly in bathrooms, basements, and exterior walls. Most are harmless. Some are not. The reason building codes increasingly require moisture-resistant paperless drywall in wet areas is precisely because that paper, the same paper holding your room together, is also a slow, quiet substrate for an unseen ecology. Inert. They are colonized. There is something humbling about standing in a room you assumed was empty and realizing it is, instead, layered. A skin of paint, a skin of paper, a skeleton of mineral, a bandage of cellulose laid by a stranger you will never meet, in a year you may not remember, sealing seams you have never seen. The strand on your wall is not a defect. It is a loose thread of a quiet inheritance, a small, frayed reminder that the rooms we live in were built by hands, by chemistry, by sediment older than human language. We move through these rooms as if they are background. They are not background. They are a slow texture that has been keeping the weather, the fire, the noise, and the dark on the other side of a paper-thin promise. And every time you reach up and pull, you are interrupting that promise without knowing it. It is just past midnight again. The heater clicks on. The streetlight still bleeds yellow through the blinds, and the single pale filament still hangs from the corner of your wall, swaying in the draft from the vent. Reception. You see it now. You see what it is attached to. The long buried ribbon running the length of the seam, the gypsum sweating its locked water, the cellulose breathing slowly with the humidity of the room. 4,000-year lineage of plastered shelters folded into a single frayed strand. You will not pull it tonight. Tomorrow, if it bothers you, you will trim it flush with a small pair of scissors. Tess it back into place with a dab of joint compound from the hardware store, and you will let the wall keep its quiet work. Sit with that. Below. What did you notice the next time you looked at a wall you thought you knew? Tomorrow morning, look again. There is another presence in that same room. And what it does behind the light switch, space between the studs, is harder to believe than this.